Buenas tardes. Una duda que me quedó es, está bien que el marxismo fracase económicamente, pero surge una revolución cultural. Me extraña no haber nombrado a Gramsci, que él mismo, en sus cuadernos famosos en la cárcel, habla que ese cambio que no se logró con el marxismo en el orden económico, se lograba en el orden cultural, sacando a la mujer de la casa y empezando esa batalla contra la mujer. Es así, no es solamente una cuestión fruto del capitalismo, el feminismo, a eso voy. Me quedó
Sí,
esa duda.
a ver, yo hago teoría feminista. A la mujer no hay que sacarla de la casa, en todo caso hay que liberar el deseo de la mujer para que pueda salir de la casa. Pero yo no me meto con Gramsci porque en realidad yo no hago teoría marxista. Lo que sí me interesa es el giro psicobolche, porque ahí se mete lo sexual. Entonces, como acá la gran médula es libidinal, sexual, lo que vos decías hoy, acá hay una pulsión, acá todo es pulsional. Entonces me metí por el lado de la sexopolítica y no hago, la verdad que no soy especialista en teoría marxista y...
Porque, perdón, Gramsci justamente habla de que hay que atacar la educación y los medios de comunicación, como lo
Sí,
mencionó.
sí. Bueno, Open Society Foundation lo tiene clarísimo. Open Society son convenios en educación y en periodismo. Sí, 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 totalmente. Pero por eso creo que está claro por dónde tenemos que ir nosotros también. Acá hay gente de educación. Hay que ir por ahí. Tienen todo tomado, tienen toda la academia tomada, tienen todas las universidades, tienen todo tomado. Sí. Ah, perdón.
Perdón, no, simplemente dos datos que probablemente conozcas y me parece que es bueno que se conozcan. Por un lado, en este momento se está dando un curso acá, en realidad no sé si está dando, porque no sé si tiene alumnos, y los cursos dependen de eso en parte, pero justamente lo da una profesora de San Juan. El curso versa sobre la noción de animal en Foucault, Derrida y Judith Butler. Pero eh, esta persona justamente, investigadora del CONICET, con su postdoctorado y todo lo que ha hecho es, digo, escrito insignia, justamente lo nombraste de algún modo, que es el transfeminismo no es un humanismo. ¿Mm? Entonces ese es el título digamos, de un artículo clarísimo, y es una de las fundadoras de ECA, que serían los estudios críticos animales. Entonces, digo, como una nueva variante de este poshumanismo que
Sí,
decías.
yo cuando hablé de materialismo me refería a eso.
Exactamente. O
Es
sea,
esa línea teórica que es el socioconstructivismo aplicado a la materia, que ellos construyen y reconstruyen, y lo que hacen ahí es performar poshumanos, transhumanos, que en realidad interespecies, transespecies,
claro, exactamente. O
y es
sea,
el
y
aplanamiento ese
el
del
humanismo por definición es especista, y entonces por definición están en contra. Por eso jamás lo que ellos proponen puede ser humanista. Ese
Bueno,
es
por
el
eso hay que
planteo de la...
recuperar por eso lo que hacen muchos teóricos neorrealistas es partir de la definición de hombre como animal. Es decir, la animalidad humana hay que retomarla y la espiritualidad. Entonces hay que teorizar eso juntos.
Bien. La segunda
Ah,
cosa que, digamos, recién nombrabas un poco que no me acuerdo exactamente el nombre, pero bueno, esta conferencia trucha que se toma como fuente vinculante de derechos.
sí,
Bueno,
yoga
en el
carta.
ámbito de la educación tenemos una cosa que es la UNESCO y ESAL, que es este tratado, digamos, de América, digamos, América Latina y Caribe, ¿no es cierto?, de universidades y todo. Entonces, en 2018 hubo una conferencia regional con una serie de metas que básicamente se refieren al derecho de todos a la educación superior. El año pasado hubo un CRES, que sería este Centro Regional de Estudios Superiores, Conferencia Regional de Estudios Superiores, CRES más 5, y ese CRES más 5, donde fueron a discutir fue gente de esta universidad, de un montón de lados, a Brasilia creo que fue. Pues resulta que ahí, bien, discutieron, lo que haya sido que discutían, pero el último día, o sea, no evidentemente recogiendo lo que estaba debatiendo, se saca un comunicado. Y en ese comunicado es una cosa muy genérica respecto de cómo nos gustaría que todo el mundo tenga acceso a la educación superior, pero después, precisamente, lo único más o menos concreto que dice es, en, debemos impulsar políticas destinadas a promover la igualdad de oportunidades para mujeres y miembros de la comunidad LGTBQAE+. Entonces, y esto, se dijo aquí en la universidad, es vinculante.
Vienen con eso, sí.
claro, es decir, el truco justamente está en estas, o sea, insisto, ni siquiera la gente que fue allá fue la que de algún modo redactó ese
Yogurt es un
documento.
panfleto, no tiene
Sí,
ningún
sí, sí, sí.
estatus de
Es que
nada.
esto también. Y sin embargo, se cita como vinculante y por eso mismo se promueven determinadas cosas como los cursos que se están diciendo. O sea, te
Bueno,
estoy dando, abonando eso.
sí, sí, totalmente.
Y la pregunta mía viene por el lado siguiente. Eh, la palabra woke, que vos debes saber mucho mejor que yo, seguramente el origen, pero bueno, yo la vengo siguiendo hace por lo menos 10 años más o menos. Claro, originalmente, woke era una palabra positiva, o sea, era un halago. Si yo quería ser woke, es decir, yo quería ser una persona despierta, una persona consciente, una persona sensible, ¿no es cierto?, a un montón de temas, que desde hace más o menos 5 años empezó a cambiar el sentido, porque se vio que justamente en el fondo no era eso verdad, y al contrario, ser woke era estar apoyando cosas que estaban vendiendo humo, por lo mismo pasa a ser cada vez más despectiva, ¿no? Pero la cuestión acá está en el manejo afectivo de las palabras, de los colores, de la música, de un montón de cosas, como integrante de toda esta revolución. No sé si
Es que no
qué
tienen
decir sobre eso.
argumentos, por eso se victimizan y por eso apelan a la falacia dominem, por eso básicamente es la victimización, el gran sufrimiento de las comunidades estas, y apelan a eso porque no tienen argumentos para dar. Y cuando das un argumento te tiran con discurso de odio y te callan directamente. Es lo que escribe Scruton, lo que le pasó, lo escribe directamente, te callan y no hablas más. Si te sacan... Te rechazan alumnos, te rechazan propuestas de papers, eso me pasó a mí, de cátedras, de seminarios, te van cancelando todo y ya está.
Bien, muy bien, ya estamos en hora, así que
Qué lástima,
agradecemos
bueno.
a la doctora. Sí,
Entonces, con la última conferencia, la conferencia de clausura del Congreso. Así que los invito a todos a sentarse para poder escuchar a nuestro conferencista, que efectivamente nos honra con su presencia. Realmente me siento honrado y lo digo con sinceridad, de poder, de tener la oportunidad de presentar al profesor Justin Stover, que es una persona conocida, ampliamente conocida a nivel internacional por sus estudios sobre los clásicos. Tras una formación de grado en estudios clásicos en una pequeña universidad de Virginia, donde tuvo el privilegio de adentrarse en áreas poco comunes, como los escritores agrarios romanos, la angelología medieval y textos latinos de la época de la Contrarreforma, el profesor Justin Stover realizó su doctorado en latín medieval en la Universidad de Harvard, con una tesis dedicada a la recepción de Platón en Occidente durante el siglo XII. Posteriormente se trasladó al Reino Unido para asumir una beca de investigación postdoctoral en, nada menos, All Souls College de la Universidad de Oxford, quizá uno de los colleges más importantes y prestigiosos de la Universidad de Oxford, donde no se enseña, sino que solamente se investiga y por lo tanto está restringido a muy pocas personas que pueden tener esa capacidad de investigación de alto nivel. Y luego de terminar de varios años su experiencia en Oxford, se incorporó a la Universidad de Edimburgo a comienzos de 2017. Su investigación se centra donde, perdón, ya lo aclaro porque me lo comentó Justin, ahora en agosto asume lo que nosotros, su tenure, ¿no es cierto? Es decir, lo que nosotros diríamos pasa a ser catedrático, diría en España, profesor titular ordinario, diríamos, en Argentina, ¿sí? Llegó al grado máximo de la carrera académica en esta Universidad del Reino Unido. No, sí, y de Escocia, digamos, para no caer en problemas. Su investigación se centra en la transmisión del patrimonio escrito de la antigüedad en forma manuscrita durante el periodo posclásico. Le interesan particularmente las maneras en que los textos clásicos fueron leídos, reutilizados y copiados en la Edad Media, así como el modo en que estos textos llegaron finalmente a la era de la imprenta. Justin Stover considera que aún queda mucho por descubrir, incluso dentro de la literatura clásica, a través del estudio de los manuscritos, textos inéditos, nuevas atribuciones y cronologías aún por establecer. En el pasado, su trabajo se ha enfocado en diversos textos filosóficos latinos transmitidos en los siglos XII y XIII, incluido un texto inédito de Apuleyo, y en textos tardoantiguos que circularon en centros continentales e insulares del siglo IX. Sobre estos temas, el profesor Stover ha escrito numerosos artículos publicados en las revistas especializadas más prestigiosas. Destaco además su último libro, The Lost History of Sextus Aurelius Victor, Edinburgh University Press, 2023. El profesor Justin Stover nos hablará de, o el título de su conferencia, Con o sin la universidad, Roger Scruton y las humanidades.
Muchas gracias. And I would apologize to all of you for speaking in English, but you can take it on trust that me not speaking to you in Spanish for an hour is doing you a favor. And I also don't apologize because I think it's very appropriate that the closing conference of this Congress is delivered in English, which is a language that Roger Scruton particularly loved. So it's an appropriate tribute to him. As will be obvious to all of you who have been here these past few days, Sir Roger Scruton was a man of culture. And it's been illustrated in so many beautiful ways by all my colleagues who have given such stimulating presentations, conferences, forums, discussions. But when we say a man of culture, we don't mean culture in just some generic sense. In the forum that we had earlier today, as you all heard, culture is, of course, intimately connected with cult, with cultus, and religious observance. But the Latin that it comes from, cullo, collere, is also about living in a place. It's about cultivation, the cultivation of fields and places. And so culture, it's not just tied to a religion, but also to a place. Um, uh, in other words, both fields and deities can be objects of cultivation. Both of these senses of the word culture, religion, and place are relevant to Scruton and his intellectual project. His culture was a particularity, an attachment to a specific tradition rooted in a specific place, and indeed formed by a particular religion and form of worship. Now, this does not mean that he was a chauvinist. Indeed, he was far from one who looked down on other customs and cultures that were not his own, and he was always willing to cite approvingly ideas and practices of other peoples, as indeed we'll see an example later. But the motivating impulse of his life and his work was the culture of Western Europe and England in particular, and especially in his later years, the Christianity which shaped it into what it was. So the theme that I'd like to speak to you about this evening involves one of the most prominent and enduring institutions created by that cult and that culture in that place, and indeed one in which England assumes a particular pride of place, and that is the university. The university as an institution has a particularly ambivalent role in Scruton's thought, simultaneously revered and reviled. To understand why, we need to go back to the beginning. The first thing that we need to establish is that the university is a specifically Western, European, and Christian creation. Obviously, no society, no people, no creed, of course, has a monopoly on education. Finding ways to preserve, transmit, and disseminate ancestral knowledge is a fundamental feature of all human societies. And indeed, it's the ground assumption for what makes an agglomeration of people living in a place into what we might recognize as a culture. Institutions of learning are found everywhere and in many different forms. In some parts of the world, they're educational establishments with a continuous history that stretches for more than 1,000 years, like the famous Al Qur'une in Morocco, and there are similar institutions in India that have been teaching continuously for that time. The classical world had its own educational structures, the academy and the lyceum in Athens, the official grammarians and rhetors of Rome and the other great cities of the empire like Carthage, Antioch, Constantinople. There were technical schools in antiquity too, like the famous Roman law school of Berytus, or what's now Beirut. And indeed, things that look like research institutions, such as the Museion in Alexandria, or the museum, with its famous library. That's the Library of Alexandria. All of these different kinds of institutions took different forms. Some of them were attached to religious institutions. The Lyceum, for example, in Athens, and the Museion in Alexandria were both, in fact, temples. And some undoubtedly were state institutions sponsored by the government, and many were both. Analogous structures to these can be found elsewhere in ancient India and Japan, Korea, China, and all over the world. In the first century's Christianity, some of these institutions were simply assimilated by Christians. So famously, in the middle of the 4th century, for all of you readers of Augustine out there, an official rhetor urbis Romae, an official rhetorician of the city of Rome, or chair of rhetoric, named Marius Victorinus, was converted in Rome. And towards the end of the century, the official rhetor urbis Cartaginis, or the official chair of rhetoric of the city of Carthage, named Favonius Eulogius, was himself a Christian and a correspondent of Augustine. He also wrote a great commentary on Cicero's Dream of Scipio. Augustine himself was a cog in that great educational machine of the Roman world. He went from teaching jobs in North Africa to Gast and Carthage to take up a position in rhetoric in Milan. In other cases, Christians established new and parallel institutions, such as the Catechetical School of Alexandria, which seems to have both been an educational institution, but also a place of more advanced theological research, particularly associated with Origen and his disciples in the late 3rd, early 4th century. With the decay of the ancient world, and its institutions, education moved more firmly into ecclesiastical contexts, with, for example, the 6th century intellectual centers, cum monasteries of Vivarium, which was founded by Cassiodorus down in Squillace in southern Italy, and Castellum Lucullanum, which was outside of Naples and was probably the place for retirement to the very last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. As well as a growing role for cathedrals. Verona offers perhaps an early example of this. And in fact, Verona, for those who are interested in the history of books, has an extraordinary fact that in the Biblioteca Capitulare now, there is a book that was written in the hand of a man named Ursicinus, who is the lector of the cathedral. And that book is exactly in the same place that it was when it was written 14 or 1500 years ago. It's dated 511, which is absolutely extraordinary and shows the longevity of these cathedrals as institutions of learning. By the time we reach the Carolingian period, the Renaissance under Charlemagne, most institutions of education are attached to monasteries or cathedrals, although we do have some evidence for other kinds of institutions, such as the Palace School at Aachen, for example, which had its master, Alcuin of York. This is incidentally the same pattern which held in the Islamic world, in which centers of learning, including Al-Qarawiyyin, were mostly attached to mosques. They were madrasas for inculcating the Quran and whatever else they do. This takes us then to the pomp of the cathedral schools in the 10th and the 11th century in Europe, an era of education which was really beautifully depicted by the scholar C. Stephen Jaeger in a book called The Envy of Angels, in which cathedrals like Laon and Chartres and Paris were the homes of masters who held European-wide reputations and to whom students flocked from far and wide. This system became a victim of its own success. Students came to Cologne because they wanted to study with Rotharius, or to Laon because they wanted to study under Anselm. It was incidentally under Anselm of Laon that the Glossa Ordinaria on the Bible was first started to be compiled. Or they went to Chartres because they wanted to study with Bernard, who is famous for teaching Platonism. These cathedral schools were particularly important for maintaining the intellectual ferment that mobility could provide, right? They were not just providing education for local students, but were drawing them in from other countries. Already in the 7th century, we can see an example of this intellectual ferment through mobility with the appointment of the Syrian Theodore to the see as Archbishop of Canterbury, which injected a fruitful seam of Greek and even Syriac learning into the Latin culture of early medieval England. Nonetheless, as often happens to those who look with a keen eye at the past, centralization happened as something of an organic process. Roman law had a massive revival in northern Italy in the late 11th century due to an accident. They rediscovered the text of Justinian's Digest in this magnificent manuscript, which we call the Littera Florentina, which is a 6th century codex about this big. It's literally like this, that contains the entirety of Justinian's legislation. Students were really excited by this and began to migrate from all over Europe to Bologna because they wanted to study the new learning of Roman law. At the same time, and for a wide variety of reasons, more and more masters or magistri of the arts and theology started to migrate to Paris around the beginning of the 12th century. What this meant in practice is that students no longer had to travel to a master that they wanted to study with. They didn't have to go to Laon or they didn't have to go to Chartres. They could simply go to Paris And in Paris, they could find suitable teachers in all the arts and in theology. Or if their interests were more legally than humanistically inclined, they could go to Bologna and find a master in Roman or canon law. In Paris, then, the masters were in direct competition with each other for students. And indeed, not just with each other, but also with new religious houses, like that of St. Victor, which was itself founded by a famous Parisian master, William of Champeaux, and which aimed to become the intellectual powerhouse of theology and biblical studies. As well as a new burgeoning religious movement called the Cistercians, which was driven by the formidable orator Bernard of Clairvaux. We have several accounts of these students who were in Paris in the 12th century surviving, like the Englishman John of Salisbury, who went and spent 10 years in Paris and describes how he went about it. You know, he decided he had to go study grammar, and so he went and studied under a master for 3 years with grammar, and then he's like, oh, I need to learn logic, so he goes to Gilbert of Poitiers and stays with him for 2 years and learns logic, and then thinks, oh, my rhetoric is really not up to par, so he goes and studies with Thierry for a few years, and then goes back to logic because he thinks he's forgotten it. I mean, it's a totally unplanned kind of system that's just going between these various masters that are there. Another student was a Levantine princeling, literally from the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, named William of Tyre, who was sent to Paris by his very wealthy family in preparation for him taking up an episcopal see in the Levant. In such an environment as this, masters had every incentive to differentiate their teaching, and this involved theatrics. So one of the most famous Parisian masters of the early 12th century was named Peter Abelard, who's famous for other reasons. But in his day, he made his name by challenging his own master, who was William of Champeaux, the guy that we just mentioned, who would go on to found St. Victor, to a public debate. And it was transparently an attempt to win students for himself so that he could start his own school. Now, this kind of competition rewarded extreme positions, okay? I'll give you an example from Abelard. Abelard is most famous for claiming that the Trinity could be discovered through natural reason alone, number one, and number two, that Plato had already taught the Trinity, and that if you just read the Timaeus carefully enough, you would find the Trinity was already there. Now, Abelard, I think, actually probably did believe this, but one can't deny that it has a certain shock value. And such claims as this could not help but make students want to learn more. It's a means of attracting students. Now, the first half of the 12th century, as a result of this, saw a succession of denunciations and heresy trials, and many of them were associated with Bernard of Clairvaux, who thought that the schools were, yes, taking things way too far. So Abelard got condemned at Soissons and Sens, and he was on his way to appeal the judgment at Sens when he died at Cluny under Peter the Venerable, never making it to Rome. William of Conches, who was another master who wrote a commentary on Plato, who probably taught at Chartres. Of Gilbert of Poitiers, who is the most famous Parisian intellectual of the middle of the 12th century. Many important religious figures, even the German mystic nun Hildegard of Bingen, were concerned that the masters of Paris had taken things too far, dangerously skirting with heresy. And secular authorities were starting to take notice as well. Now, the situation, which we'll leave Paris aside for a moment, was a little bit different in Bologna. Focused as it was in the study of law, heresy was a much less of a burning concern. Even so, there were issues. Many foreign students had come to Bologna, just like they do today. And the students who traveled there began to feel that they were being mistreated, both by the townspeople and by their own teachers, their masters. So with those different situations in Bologna and Paris, we get a parallel solution, a simultaneous development starting from opposite concerns, i.e. in Paris, concerns about masters, in Bologna, concerns about students. In Bologna, students banded together in what they called nationes, nations. That is societies of students with shared national origins. And these societies would act for mutual aid and defense, and ultimately would start hiring teachers. And therefore, the students were the ones that had the power because they were the ones who were directly hiring teachers. These became universitates scholarium, okay, unions of students. And ultimately, the different universitates banded together into a broader entity, which was called a studium. And since Bologna was an imperial city, they wrote and obtained from the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa a charter to establish the University of Bologna, which was really the Studium Generale, or as it's still known, the Alma Mater Studiorum. Now in Paris, it was the masters who took the lead. They banded together into a cartel, so to speak, a guild, a monopoly, so that they would no longer be competing with each other for students and that they could keep intellectual regulation in-house without the need for civil courts or ecclesiastical courts to intervene. The legal basis that they had was attached to the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, so it's in continuity with what came before. But what came out of that was something entirely new, an organic development. And this was the beginning of the University of Paris. Here, let me make a quick aside. There has been much written on what the university means and some very profound reflections. But I have to tell you that as a philologo at heart, that what universitas means has nothing to do with the unity of learning and all of that, and how it helps students, et cetera, and you're drawing everything. No, it refers to a cartel, okay? It means it's a guild, a union is what it means, right? It's a group of masters or of students who regulate themselves. That's what the universitas originally meant. At the same time, various pious people founded houses for poor scholars, and these houses would become collegia, colleges, which tended to play a large role in the education of those individual students. As a result, a complex but logical structure emerged, a university which could offer degrees or some kind of credential. Most importantly, the credential of the jus ubique docendi, or the right of teaching anywhere, and which would oversee examination. And then there were faculties in which all the masters of a particular branch of study, i.e. the liberal arts or theology or law, would be able to coordinate and regulate their teaching. And finally, colleges, which provided the point of entry and supervision for individual students. This then is the dual origin of the university, which from opposite starting points in Bologna and Paris converged on a particular model which could be replicated elsewhere. It was, and very quickly. So Oxford already started to emerge in the 12th century. Cambridge, the other place from disaffected Oxford academics, followed shortly thereafter. Already from the beginning of the 13th century, Oxford had a chancellor, and from the middle of it, there were founded constituent colleges, University College in 1249, Balliol College in 1261. So too elsewhere in Italy, Padua was founded in 1222 by scholars from Bologna. In Spain, Salamanca in 1218. In Scotland, St. Andrews in 1410 by scholars from the University of Paris. In German-speaking lands, Heidelberg was founded in 1348. In Bohemia, the Charles in Prague in 1347. This same model would be imported into the New World, with Santo Tomas in the Dominican Republic, founded in 1538, San Marco in Peru, founded in 1551, and of course, here in Argentina, Cordoba, founded in 1610. All three of them, one might add, and more besides, predate the foundation of Harvard College in 1638, and indeed are even before the charter for the University of Henrico, which would later be founded as William and Mary in 1618. So one could go on with the spread of universities, but that's far enough. What's important for us is that these were blended institutions. secular and ecclesiastical. Some of them had charters from kings, others had charters from popes, most of them with both. My university, Edinburgh, was in fact the first university with a charter from the town council, which is very sad. Whereas Glasgow has a papal charter. And if you go to Glasgow's website, they will still tell you to this day that their authority to grant degrees comes from their papal charter. The Pope said they could, even though they're all Presbyterians or heathens, but formerly Presbyterians. They were hence a result of this, a blend of what we might call public and private. While officially licensed and in that respect civic institutions, they were financially independent and self-regulating. Indeed, most colleges tended to be founded out of a very specific pious intent, patrons who wanted clerks to pray for their souls, right? And that's why All Souls College is All Souls. It was literally founded to provide suffrages for the poor souls, and particularly that of Henry Chichela, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This private, quasi-private status gave universities something of an autonomy, with the frequently invoked right to enact discipline on its own members. Indeed, in the Middle Ages, Heidelberg had its own jail, university jail for students, which I think is something that should be adopted all around the world. Much to the chagrin of neighboring townspeople who saw the students both as objects ripe for exploitation, but also dangerous and out of control outsiders. And the history of all the university towns of the Middle Ages, especially Oxford and Cambridge, are marked by periodic riots in which, 3 students are killed, 18 townspeople, etc. The king has to intervene and dire things happen. The autonomy that universities had was the origin of libertas scholastica, okay, the scholastic liberty, shall we say, which in its origins was a corporate right to self-government, not academic freedom or an individual right for academics to hold opinions. The most striking example of this, which is one of the contributions of Scotland to the world, is the idea of university representation in Parliament. This practice, whereby the ancient universities of Scotland had their own representatives in the Scottish Parliament, was imported to England by James VI and I, and from there spread. While abolished in England in the 20th century, there do indeed remain university members of both the Irish and Rwandan senates. The idea here, which to my mind is an interesting and productive one, is that universities are neither agencies of the government, nor ecclesiastical bodies, nor private associations, but something else. A tertium quid, a guild that somehow survived the shipwreck of medieval Christian Europe. And that brings us, finally, to the point of this historical preface. The topic for discussion today is the university, i.e. this particular and long-lasting legacy of medieval Christendom, and not nebulously defined institutions of higher learning, as the word is often used today. It is necessary to understand the origin of the university, therefore, in order, in an Aristotelian fashion, to account for its peculiar nature. Edward Gibbon, in a particularly vicious comment about Oxford and Cambridge in his day, talked about how they can't escape the taint of their scholastic origins, which is the same idea in a negative sense. Scruton himself was well aware and careful of this. When he enters some more hazardous terrain is where he distinguishes phases in the development of the European university. According to Scruton, the history of the university can be divided into 2 phases. One in which the studia divinitatis, or divinity, predominated, and a later post-Renaissance phase in which the studia humaniora, which we know as the humanities, became dominant. At first blush, this is obviously true. The prestige of theology, of the Regina Scientiarum, the Queen of Sciences, was absolutely a feature of the medieval university, and it's undoubtedly true that the humanities surpassed it in prestige in the post-Renaissance university. But it's only half the story. The arts faculty, the liberal arts that is, was always the largest in any of the ancient universities and served as the gatekeeper for all the higher faculties. Students in the late medieval university were reading their classics, although not necessarily in the way that it is familiar to us. If you look, for example, at the works of 14th century English friars, like the Dominicans Thomas Wallis and Robert Holcott, as memorably explored by Beryl Smalley, we can find a fascination for and depth of classical learning, which does not compare unfavorably to the proto-humanist of Italy, such as Lovato Levati and Albertino Musato. It's just that the form of their scholarship, and indeed the way they wrote Latin, that distinguishes them. Remember, the Renaissance is primarily a movement in the history of Latin style. It was about how you write Latin. Indeed, studying the classics was embedded in the very charters of many medieval universities, starting with Paris. So in Paris's own charter, it dictates that students have to study Priscian, who wrote the world's most influential Latin grammar. As a result, medieval universities did find one way to be both an intellectually regulating institution as well as a center for the study of for the studia humaniora. Now, this is not to say that Scruton was not right in some sense. The post-Westphalian university, and particularly as it developed in German-speaking lands in the 18th and 19th century, is indeed something different, characterized not by libertas scholastica, or the ability of the scholarly community to self-regulate, but by Lehrfreiheit und Lernfreiheit, or freedom in teaching and freedom in learning. It is this, which we heard about earlier in Professor Hervel's lecture, that would give us the modern university with its academic freedom, which guarantees the rights of members of the community, scholars and students alike, to follow their own lights without external and political interference. The origins of this are really not hard to find. The very idea of the Res Publica Literarum, the Republic of Letters, pointed the way to universities as independent bodies, not answerable to the surrounding civil society and its political and religious exigencies, but responsible instead, as these humanists would have understood it, only to spirit and humanity. At the same time, there was increasing desire to much broaden the provision for natural and experimental sciences. Well, these were not absent from the medieval university. You can think for a moment of Roger Bacon and Robert Grosseteste in England, or Raymond Lull in Catalonia. They were very much a niche part of it. The liberal university, by contrast, was dedicated as much to scientific and indeed occasionally technological inquiry as to humanistic. These developments were accompanied by the gradual transformation of the university from the blended institutions I talked about before into agencies of the state, a process that was very prominent and rapid in German lands and comparatively slow in some others, such as in the United States. There are certainly antecedents. Already in the Renaissance, some Italian universities, such as the Studium at Padua, were no longer financially independent, but instead actually had their professors paid out of the public purse. This brings us to the paradox at the heart of the liberal university. Precisely at the same time as the university was becoming an agency of the state, it was simultaneously asserting its internal freedom to act without political directive or influence. So keep that paradox in mind as we return to Scruton. What did Roger Scruton want from the university? He could appreciate Newman's idea of the university, but he, perhaps rightly, felt that it did not offer sufficient contemporary guidance. Newman was sketching out an idealized version of 19th century Oxford, returned again to the Catholic faith, operating much like a medieval university as a regulator of opinion, of doctrina, with the particular goal towards forming the characters of students, which is an interesting, very particular feature of one strand of university thought in Britain and not so much elsewhere. For Scruton, these conditions no longer held. Instead, the task of serious scholars who had serious thoughts was to embrace ever more tightly the Lehrfreiheit und Lernfreiheit of the liberal university, so that unpopular opinions, and indeed of the unpopular opinions that he was not ashamed to hold, could be protected institutionally and offered on an equal basis to students. Scruton really had no interest in drumming the Marxist or the feminist or the post-structuralist from the university. What he wanted was for the great tradition to have a seat at the table as well. Alongside this, he wanted real scholarship, that is, people interested in finding out true things. One of his favorite examples of real scholarship was Egyptology. And he wanted this to be fostered and not required to answer only to contemporary concerns. In other words, what he wanted was a liberal university, a liberal one in the tradition of Goethe and Mill. What he found instead in the contemporary academic landscape was a university which honored intellectual and academic freedom in theory, but in practice made it impossible for people like him, dare I say, people like us, to be admitted and to flourish. Academics, in his view, could boast as much as they like about how their teaching and scholarship was free of government influence. And indeed, they were very likely to do so when a right-wing government happened to be in power. But in fact, they were merely enthralled to another alien spirit, which was hostile to most of the texts, the objects and ideas which had formed the basis of the tradition out of which the university itself was born. For Scruton, then, academic freedom in the university was something of a dead letter. Ultimately, not even tolerance of dissenting ideas was possible in the contemporary university. And that's not the only crisis of the liberal university. The economic paradox at its heart has been fully exposed. And many people ask the serious question of whether they should provide financial subvention to institutions which are both inimical to their values and to their interests. That's incoherent. And it's an incoherence obvious to every taxpayer in Western countries who has ever wondered or said out loud, why are my tax dollars going to support gender studies? As crudely as the sentiment is sometimes expressed, the idea behind it is in fact cogent and compelling. If universities are to be public bodies subsidized from the public purse, why should they not be susceptible to the influence of the state and directed towards ends which are deemed socially valuable? And the answer can only go one way. If a university has to account for its social utility to justify its funding, the humanities will always be the part to suffer. Sure, we are clever people. We can tell the public that there is great social benefit to be derived from studying the classics, or history, or literature, or Egyptology, or Old Norse, or medieval philosophy, or Sumerian archaeology. But are we really being honest when we say that? On the other hand, the social, political, economic benefits of research into physics, biology, chemistry, engineering is much easier to articulate. Even when research does not have immediate technological benefits, I'm thinking here of astrophysics, for example, or the kind of quantum mechanics investigated at the Large Hadron Collider, scientists can plausibly and persuasively argue that there will be unexpected future technical and technological advancements which will justify unprofitable research today. And if you're interested in this subject, I wrote an essay a few years ago called "There's No Case for the Humanities," in which I lay that out at greater length. And this means that the very institutions which are the heir of the Republic of Letters are ultimately asking hard questions about the future of humanistic studies. After all, we in fact are living in an age where come next year, there will no longer be a chair of Oriental languages at, of all places, the University of Leiden. The inevitable result is the triumph of the scientific and technical disciplines, which are able to portray themselves as investments and the further marginalization of the humanistic disciplines from which and for which the university was born. Now, I do not dispute the essential truth of Roger Scruton's view, and I don't think anyone could who has experience with the contemporary academic landscape. Let me give an anecdote here. I recall once when I was a doctoral student at Harvard, standing outside a building one Wednesday in November. I suppose it would have been November 7th, 2006. And there's a reason I know this, a Wednesday because a national election had been held the day before. A very distinguished professor, whom I did not know particularly well, happened to be coming up to the building and remarked to me, "We did pretty well last night." Well, I was a graduate student. I just smiled and acknowledged, but as a remark, it was revealing. This professor did not have to know me. The very fact that I was there, a member of the university and the academic community, was enough in her mind to ensure that there was no possibility that we were not on the same side politically. A win for her was necessarily a win for me as well. As it is, I don't think it was great, but she was not that far off the mark. The odds were most certainly in her favor. 99 out of 100 people she could have said that to would have agreed. Indeed, one could argue that she had a greater authenticity in her relationship to the academic community than I did. For her, shared political convictions were part and parcel of being part of that intellectual community. I relate this anecdote because it's one that Scruton himself would have been very familiar with. A man who spent the majority of his life in a position contiguous to the university, but only, especially after 1980 and really after he left Birkbeck, on the margins, because their notions of academic freedom and intellectual diversity did not go quite so far as to include people of his views. But I also mentioned this anecdote here because in a way, it's an authentically medieval experience. As Scruton himself hinted, there is indeed some sense in which the contemporary university actually represents a return to the medieval model. As I noted above, the purpose of Libertas Scholastica was precisely so that the university could be a self-regulating community. In other words, it stands as an enforcer of a particular orthodoxy amongst its members. Obviously, the orthodoxy of the contemporary university is a far cry from the orthodoxy of the University of Paris in 1250. Nonetheless, structurally, there are parallels. What a university was supposed to be was a community which could both impose and impart a pattern of thought and maintain that pattern of thought and the ideas that underlie it without interference from outside forces. This is also what the contemporary university does with its manifold orthodoxies, which almost no one on the outside could bring themselves to hold. The lack of objective frames of reference, the multiplicity of genders, the purely economic and material interpretation of social and historical movements. These are our orthodoxies. And in an unstated way, while still pretending to be the liberal university of the 19th century, our universities are completely committed to enforcing these orthodoxies ad intra. In other words, we have returned to the medieval university without the intellectual and spiritual heritage which made them what they are. Scruton saw this as well, as he wrote, "But if the university renounces its calling in the matter of truth-directed argument, then we do not only lose a great benefit from which all of us profit, we lose the university as an institution. It becomes something else, a center of indoctrination without a doctrine, a way of closing the mind without the great benefit that is conferred by religion, which also closes the mind, but closes it around a community creating narrative." This is the nostalgia that this passage is tinged with does indeed ring true. It's not hard to feel the same sadness about the loss of what was indeed beautiful about the liberal university. I might think the sheer intellectual ferment of the German universities around the turn of the 20th century, or the austerity and profundity of thought nurtured at the University of Chicago in the century's middle, even if there was a nuclear reactor underneath, or indeed post-war Oxford and Cambridge. At the same time, the facets of the university which Scruton is objecting to, its lack of space for people who hold dissenting views, is precisely like religion, a community creating narrative. And as wrong as it may be, there's a way in which it sidesteps the paradox of the liberal university. Serious practitioners of gender theory or devotees of French philosophy, except perhaps the most deluded amongst them, don't actually try to justify their pursuits in economic terms. Indeed, they're prone to flaunt their insularity, unapologetic about intellectual pursuits which the vulgar masses outside could never hope to properly appreciate. The liberal university enforces institutional homogeneity with Lehrfreiheit and Lernfreiheit, both professors and students free to research and study according to their own lights. Every institution ends up being almost exactly the same, differing only in prestige. The motto of Cornell University, a quotation by Ezra Cornell, who founded in 1865, sums up it perfectly. I would found an institution where any person can find instruction, any study. Were every university like this, open to any person to study anything, every university would be exactly the same. And this is what happened over the course of the 20th century. The academic tribe became remarkably homogeneous. In the year 1990, say, there would be no substantive difference in the range of offering and the ideological approach that underpins the University of Tennessee, Princeton University, LMU in Munich, and the University of Manchester in the UK. All of them would offer the same range of courses. All of them would be taught by a faculty with remarkably similar political and ideological bent. This is a marked difference to the medieval university, which had actual intellectual diversity, not within institutions, but between them. After some of the Libri Naturalis of Aristotle were no longer permitted to be taught in the University of Paris because they were a dangerous catalyst to heresy in the early 13th century, the papally sponsored University of Toulouse would openly advertise that, quote, those who wish to scrutinize the bosom of nature to the inmost can hear the books of Aristotle, which were forbidden at Paris. After the 1270s, when the Bishop of Paris as chancellor issued a list of condemned propositions, a number of Dominican scholars migrated to Oxford, where they could continue to hold them. William of Ockham quotes one of them saying, excommunication has not crossed the channel. One benefit of the return of the medieval university is the possibility it offers for genuine diversity in terms of institutions, the kinds of academic experiments that Scruton saw as a sign of hope, and we've seen some examples of today. St. John's in Annapolis, Maryland, Hillsdale College in Michigan. To these, we can add others like the Matthias Corvinus Collegium in Budapest or Walston College in Florida, in Georgia. With the ongoing reimagining of New College of Florida, we even have the example of a public state-funded university being transformed into a new and different kind of institution. Only time will tell how successful these experiments are, but the fact that they exist is indeed encouraging. But perhaps we should not be so modest. As I noted above, the paradox at the heart of the liberal university is between its autonomy and dependence on the state. One of the things I said was that humanistic disciplines have a hard time justifying the investment of resources into them, and this is not quite true. While finding the social benefit of such disciplines is indeed hard, there is a way in which they represent a political investment. There is something of an unspoken accord between universities and certain political parties. Universities will be supported by the government, and in turn, they will produce a reliable stream of left-wing votes. In both the US and the UK, the situation has become so extreme that educational qualification is the #1 statistical correlation for voting patterns. You're more likely able to deduce someone's voting preference by knowing whether they're university educated than you are by knowing their gender, race, religion, income, geographic location, or class. That's the real investment that universities provide, and it's one that the electorate is fully aware of. What the universities in the US and Hungary here and in some other places did not realize was that regime change could threaten their funding until relatively recently. Nonetheless, the precarious financial dependence on the state has created vulnerabilities. The Harvard University of 20 years ago could have laughed off threats to their government funding with an ability to self-fund virtually in perpetuity from endowment income. But with vast sums of government money they have come to gorge on in the concomitant bloat, the removal of government funds suddenly represents an existential threat. It remains to be seen, outside of a few interesting cases like New College of Florida, and I might mention the University of Oklahoma as well, whether states can in fact leverage financial dependence and institutional reform. After all, the death of the liberal university allows a much greater variety and heterogeneity of institutions without one model holding sway. It's possible that alternative institutions might finally have a chance to survive. So let me conclude here. For myself, as it was indeed for Roger Scruton, what I care about is the continuation and preservation of the traditional humanistic disciplines. The scientists will be able to take care of themselves, whether that's in the hands of government labs, corporations, universities, whatever. I don't think it's a matter of great importance. But the disciplines by which and for which the university was created, they're a much more difficult case. And I think we can learn something from one of the most formative experiences in Scruton's life when he went to Czechoslovakia, and there he found the students in Prague who just wanted to learn, even if they weren't going to get credentials, as we heard about before, and had the underground university that was actually centered around learning. For Scruton, this meant that, you know, in the future, maybe that was the way forward, that it was just with students who wanted to learn and that the corrupt institutions could be abandoned. And I believe, like Scruton did, that the humanities will persist with or without the university, as long as there are people in the West who want to find out who they are and why. And like students of Czechoslovakia in the 1980s, but I do not think that the institution they created, the university, should simply be abandoned. Quite the opposite. Like everything handed down to us, it is our task to preserve it. So here, let me end then with a modest proposal. The financial problem cannot be easily solved. So simply getting the state out of the tertiary education business without some other model for how universities will survive will simply mean the death of the whole sector. Another way forward is possible. I've gotten to know many colleagues around the world. The vast majority of them are on the political left. And yet for most of them, what they really care about is not transient political fights, but rather their fields. They care about Greek lyric poetry, Attic orators, the transformation of the Roman Empire under Constantine, the renaissance of Latin literature in the 6th century, legal writing, the long history, writing the history of the barbarian peoples of early medieval Europe, the dissemination of classical texts, the circulation of private poetic collections in Jacobean England. If the state is to do anything, it should encourage them to do precisely those things. Ultimately, the cost of research in the humanities is trivial, and as much as it matters to us, the amount of money it takes to support academic work in the humanities absolutely pales in contrast to what it takes for scientific and medical research, which itself is a relatively small part of state expenditure. Hence, for a modest investment, the government can set up a system by which individual research in the humanities can be funded on a strict basis of academic excellence and with peer assessment. It's my opinion that the very scarcity of resources has created solidarity and reinforced group identity in time-honored fashion. By making individual funding possible, academics are forced to compete with each other, and ultimately disciplinary concerns may well prove stronger than political virtue signaling. The promise of an objective process which examines the scholarly merit of a research proposal as opposed to social and political factors may well offer hope to prospective scholars who do not fit in politically with what's expected of the professoriate. If we can push politics back to a subsidiary role and return to matters of real importance, like the chronology of Shakespeare's play. And that harkens back to the medieval university too, where Libertas Scholastica was derived from the self-regulation of the academic profession. And these ideas have been put into place in Europe through the European Research Council, which does indeed fund real and genuine scholarship alongside a lot of crazy things, but it funds things like science and dogma, tracing natural knowledge within scholastic theology, or fluidity in the medieval Aristotle, readers and readings of the Greek Latin translations. These are literally funded by the European Union, and they're clearly things of academic merit. The only real objection is political. How do you tell the populace that investigating the Latin translation of Aristotle is a worthy use of public funds? After all, people in general, people on the right in particular, are notoriously bad at being able to distinguish between woke pseudo-scholarship, naked activism, barely even pretending to be objective inquiry, and completely legitimate academic work. I don't think there's any easy way to message this beyond keeping the process as independent as possible so that the state does not actually have to take responsibility for what research is funded. But let me just end by saying what we have now, I think, is what Scruton might have seen as a particularly opportune time. The liberal university, for all its strengths as well as its devastating weaknesses, is failing after a good 200-year run. What comes after is less clear, even if it has some clear contiguities with the pre-modern. Whatever we can do to help shape what it becomes by encouraging the work that the university is created to do may well be crucial in determining what we leave for generations to come. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Stover, por su magnífica conferencia. Y tenemos 10 minutos para preguntas, si pueden ser breves, mejor, que las podemos hacer o en inglés o en español.
Thank you very much, Professor Sprock. And those who want to ask in English, feel free to do it. And those who want to elaborate the question in Spanish, I can help with the translation. Puede preguntar en español, yo ayudo en la traducción.
Puedo empezar yo entonces. I don't know if this is a question for you or for our Chileans from Chile colleagues, because your proposal, Professor Stover, about how the state could found the humanities, I think it's quite similar that the system that Chile have, the CONICIT, because in Chile, the humanities are founded on the basis of individuals in a very strict evaluation by peers. So it's not founded, I mean, the money has not arrived for research at the university, but to persons, individual persons that have to compete between them, among them, and then they are very, very strictly evaluated by peers. So maybe you are one of the, I mean, you, José Luis and Vanessa are an example of the proposal of Professor Stover. I don't know what you say.
Goes to humanities and how much money goes to is determined by state. So that's a problem.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
You have to buy it.
Okay.
Yeah, well, if I can just address that very quickly, right? So you can view online, open the things that have been funded by the European Research Council, and you will find some crazy stuff. I skipped the crazy titles, but I can give them to you now. Climate change and human mobility, the role of compound and cascading risks, refugees' political participation in state making and displacement, and my personal favorite, diversity outdoors, embodied ethno-racial inequalities, and outdoor recreation in Europe. So things like that do get funded, right? But alongside, you have things that are of genuine value. And I've gone through the process myself multiple times. You do get the sense that you are being evaluated on academic merit. It is not looking for, that you're sending the right signals, because the fact is people are competing with each other and the signals aren't enough. So it's all about the level of funding that's allowed. And what my proposal is basically is if the state wants to defuse the university sector, make it less political, get them humanities people, because they're the worst offenders in terms of politicizing things, get them focusing on competing with each other so that they can work in their fields. And then they're not going to spend their energies on political activism. And especially, and that last point about recruitment, I think is really important. If people who don't feel like they fit in to the homogeneity of the liberal university think that there's a chance for an academic career because they could win funding, then they might go for it, right? Whereas right now it is hard, for people who don't have orthodox views to want to pursue that as a path.
So thank you very much. It was a very, very interesting view about the university. And what I was thinking when you were talking, it's, in a way, we may say this cartel university of the medieval ages is inevitable. I don't know if maybe you can't sign out certain very specific places in some periods with the liberal university, with a lot of diversity inside existed, but at the end of the day, what happened is like some kind of a liberal spirit, and we say we are liberal, we say we accept all views, we don't do that. And it doesn't really matter which view is the dominant. I mean, it's so you say something interesting about in the medieval ages, you have like a competition of views between universities. And I find that something much more sincere in a way. If you go to a Catholic university, ideally, you should know what kind of doctrine you would learn there. Since you go to a, let's say, the woke university, so you should know what you are going to learn, what is the perspective of this university. Is the idea of universities being cartels and explicit about their programs and doctrines and what they prefer. And so there may be also a way to seize this. I mean, to make not maybe individuals or also individuals, but also universities compete among themselves. Something that's Maria Jose said something around this yesterday, I think, about a very particular thing in Argentina, why private university had some kind of conservative, or not very, but kind of conservative universities in Argentina that are private and do not receive any funding. So from the state, why do not we start giving funding to that? I am not going to say we are going to do that because I am in the government. So this is not a project. This is a question. But I really see some potential here. I mean, make universities that are explicit about their ideas compete for students that go looking for those ideas. I don't know what you do, what will be your views or on this.
No, thank you. I mean, I especially appreciate that you mentioned Catholic universities, which have an interesting history, right? Because obviously, all universities that started were Catholic just by virtue of being in Catholic societies, right? But the idea of Catholic universities as opposed to other universities is a much later development, right? And part of it is one of the developments of the post-Westphalian University, where you had this hilarious thing in which you would have a theology faculty, so it had to have religious affiliation. And so some German universities to this day have dual theology faculties, a Catholic faculty and a Protestant faculty, which is very funny, right? You know, in the States is where this really took off as a means of sort of, you know, differentiation, right? And that's why institutions like the University of Notre Dame were started, or Boston College or Georgetown, right? And they were to provide a differentiated experience, right? One that would respect the, you know, and nurture Catholic belief in the students. Then you get the Land O'Lakes Declaration in the States in 1967, I think, right? And basically, the leading Catholic universities say, well, it's a choice between being a university or being Catholic, and so we will be a university, right? And it's exactly the homogenizing tendency I'm talking about. We will try to be exactly like everywhere else. So Notre Dame wanted to be exactly like Harvard or something like that. Georgetown wanted to be exactly like the great liberal arts schools of the Northeast, right? I mean, no differentiation whatsoever. And it is absolutely true in almost every country to this day that, you know, I mean, if the university has the word Catholic in its name, it probably just means it's worse, right? No, that's unfair, but you know what I mean. It really doesn't, you don't actually get a differentiated experience in any meaningful way, right? So, and that's because that's not part of the liberal university project. So if we can admit that the liberal university project is over, then we can start having real differentiated views. And so one institution which I mentioned, which has always been different, was St. John's. Which never became a normal place. It's still not a normal place in any way. Half the students are reactionary, the other half are Marxists, or even worse, they're Jacobins who will themselves man the guillotines when the time comes. So it has a very curious intellectual ferment, right? And they only do great books kinds of things, and they do scientific experiments with period equipment and other strange things. But in a survey of university professors, right, of the political affiliation, you had sort of explicitly conservative institutions like Hillsdale, right, had a majority Republican affiliation amongst the faculty. And then all the regular institutions were anywhere between 90 and 98% Democrat versus Republican. But Hillsdale was a very weird number. It was 40% Republican, right? Which actually suggests that something is going right there, that there's real political diversity amongst its faculty, a sort of 50-50 kind of split, not just a conservative institution or a liberal one, right? But one in which, you know, different ideas are actually discussed. But that's because they're not a liberal university, right? They're offering a very particular educational product in a very particular tradition, not trying to do everything. Like, they don't even give their students majors. They all do the same course for everyone. There are no options. You have to study Greek and history of science. You know, and I think it's an example of how it actually works. And it's a place that Roger was also very fond of.
Thank you very much again, Professor Stover, for your lecture. Yes, we can once again. Yeah. Y para finalizar el Congreso, invito en primer lugar al doctor Guillermo Jensen, director de Relaciones Internacionales de la Secretaría de Educación de la Nación, y al doctor Hugo Costarelli Brandi, director del Departamento de Filosofía de esta facultad, a dar las palabras conclusivas del Congreso. No se asusten, me dijeron que no hablarán más de media hora cada uno, así es que no.
Oh, no, thank you, thank you.
Empiezo yo. Ok, listo, perfecto. Bueno, por los próximos 50 minutos yo quería hacer una breve finalización del Congreso. Esperemos que me alcance la batería, en fin, veremos. Bueno. Siempre, absolutamente siempre, hay que ir a las reuniones organizativas de los congresos. Esta es una consigna que todo académico debería grabar en su memoria a fuego, y esto no se debe tanto a una cuestión de responsabilidad o de respuesta al imperativo categórico kantiano o a la búsqueda de la perfección humana, sino más bien al más elemental de los motivos humanos por los cuales solemos hacer las cosas, es decir, evitar mayores trabajos. Pues bien, yo falté a la mentada reunión organizativa. Y aquí estoy, sin mérito alguno, diciendo las palabras de cierre, es decir, castigado. Bueno, en fin. Puesto ante esta compleja situación, se me ocurrió que una de las primeras cosas que debía hacerse en un cierre era agradecer. Sin embargo, conociéndome, sea por motivos de debilidad mnemotécnica o de brevedad de tiempo para hablar, advertí que me sería imposible nombrar a todos y cada uno de los participantes, expositores, foristas, ponentes, plenarios, colaboradores y estudiantes. Mucho más difícil sería mencionar uno por uno a los organizadores, desde Rubén hasta el último de los estudiantes de la Academia de Humanidades, ya que podría parecer una inmodesta autopromoción. Por otra parte, transitar el camino cuantitativo y con ello subrayar que hubieron 75 intervenciones entre conferencias, ponencias y foros con representantes de 7 países y 23 universidades, parecía una información parcial de esas que el Principito miraría con sospecha. Nosotros, dice, que comprendemos la vida, nos burlamos de los números. Lo que era seguro es que debería agradecer a la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras en la persona de su decano, a la Universidad Nacional de Cuyo en la figura de su rectora y al hub húngaro-scrutoniano en la figura de sus representantes, junto a la del embajador de Hungría por apoyar este evento, el cual jamás podría haberse llevado adelante sin su generosa ayuda. Pero cuando me pareció que ese sería un buen cierre, me di cuenta de que debería también agradecerle a Roger Scruton por su legado. Al fin y al cabo, el Congreso lo tenía como centro de sus conversaciones. Y con él, nobleza obliga, debería también agradecer a su vez a Platón, a Shakespeare, a Sófocles, a Dante, a Agustín de Hipona, a Tomás de Aquino y a un larguísimo etcétera de gente precedente. Como dice con mucho tino Chesterton, agradecer solo a quienes hemos transitado estas aulas entre el miércoles y el viernes es algo bastante mezquino y antidemocrático, ya que aceptar la tradición, sostiene el enorme inglés, es como conceder derecho de voto a la más oscura de las clases sociales, la de nuestros antepasados. No es más que la democracia de los muertos. La tradición se rehúsa a someterse a la pequeña y arrogante oligarquía de aquellos que solo por casualidad andan todavía por la tierra. Pero claro, la tarea de repente se volvió infinita e imposible. ¿Cómo agradecer a tantísima gente? ¿Cómo reconocer su esfuerzo? A buena parte de ellos, por no decir a la mayoría, no podríamos ni entregarle un scrutante Malbec, o al menos no parecería que lo pudieran disfrutar. Con todo, en ese instante, una de las personas a las que también debía dar gracias, Séneca, me regaló la solución. ¿Quieres agradecer debidamente un beneficio? Dice, recíbelo con agrado. Esto era muy cierto. El agradecimiento honesto frente a algo que no podemos en justicia equilibrar o compensar adecuadamente no debe conducirnos al apabullamiento y la inmovilidad que lo enorme suele producir en nosotros. La respuesta era muy simple y cierta: recibirlo con agrado. Todo el acervo humano capitalizado por siglos acerca de lo que son las cosas, el mismo hombre y Dios, allí está simplemente para ser recibido y hallar con ello un particular y esencial gozo, el exquisito gozo del sentido de la vida humana, ese que según Aristóteles, otro de aquellos a los que debía agradecer, es lo que todos los hombres desean por naturaleza saber. Si era cierto lo de que el loco de Nietzsche, el loco es el parágrafo, no estoy calificando a Nietzsche, al menos no estoy emitiendo un juicio de valor, ¿sí? Si era cierto lo que el loco de Nietzsche decía, aquello de que la Ilustración había asesinado a Dios y con ello al mismo género humano al quitarle su ancla de sentido, también lo era que la tradición seguía estando allí para recordarnos que el sentido de la vida humana sigue existiendo, que ésta sigue siendo valiosa y que más allá de las circunstancias epocales, la verdad, el bien y la belleza siguen sanando a las generaciones que tercamente transitan la tierra. La tarea, por lo pronto, parecía muy clara y una vez más, otra de las personas a las que debía agradecer, Virgilio en este caso, me sugirió el camino. Se trata quizás de una de las imágenes más poderosas que nos ha dejado la tradición respecto de cómo y cuál es su papel, sobre todo para un mundo en llamas, y que podemos encontrar en el segundo episodio de la Eneida. Allí, el héroe, en medio de una Troya caída y devastada, no solo por la astucia de los saqueos, sino por la propia y estulta vanidad troyana, ante el cruel asesinato del mismo Príamo, rey de Troya, dice que por primera vez sintió temor. Todo su mundo, es decir, su rey, sus dioses y su ciudad, se deshacían ante sus ojos y por ello no pocos aprobarían sus acciones si se hubiera entregado a la desesperación, al dolor o a la simple venganza, descargando su impotencia al terminar con la vida de Helena, la aparente causa de todos los males. Pero Eneas no procedió así, y su ejemplo es notable. Él confió en el poder curativo y humano de la tradición. Como sabemos, Eneas volvió a su casa, alzó en hombros a su padre, ya que éste no podía caminar, tomó la mano de su hijo Iulo, cargó como pudo con los dioses penates que había rescatado del alcázar del palacio de Príamo y partió guiado por ellos, siguiendo una especie de estrella que le indicaba el camino. Pienso que no puede haber mejor imagen del papel que deberíamos cumplir quienes, solo por casualidad, andamos todavía por la tierra. En medio de toda catástrofe es preciso llevar en los hombros a Anquises, el saber de los padres, en los brazos a los penates, el saber de los dioses, y guiar a Iulo, es decir, a las futuras generaciones, a seguir adelante. Solo agrego que sería bueno tener el cuidado de no extraviar a la esposa en el camino, alerta de spoiler, como le aconteció al pobre héroe. Esas cosas siempre terminan mal. Creo que en el fondo de eso se trata y de eso se ha tratado este Congreso. Hemos escuchado académicos quienes nos han presentado el saber tradicional, uno que por su vitalidad y fuerza sabe dialogar y confrontar los males contemporáneos, subrayando problemas y soluciones. Hemos visto a jóvenes profesores asumir ese pensar y nos hemos alegrado con la presencia de muchos estudiantes universitarios y secundarios. Yo, un hombre singular más, junto a todos los que han participado de la organización y realización de este Congreso, a los que no nombro individualmente por las razones aducidas al principio, solo quiero agradecerles a todos por participar de esta locura que inventó mi querido amigo Rubén Peretó, y en la que, como nuevos Sanchos, aunque conversos a la fe del Quijote, nos hemos sumado con generosidad, reconociendo que los molinos no son tales, sino que son realmente gigantes peligrosos. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muy brevemente y sin la calidad de las palabras ni remotamente cercano que ha pronunciado aquí el colega, quería agradecer a Rubén, a todos los organizadores. Hay poco tiempo, es rápido, pero hay que hacerlo. A el embajador de Hungría y a toda la delegación que ha venido y ha participado, a todos los jóvenes que han contribuido en estos días. Y solo 3 cosas muy breves. La primera es que sobre Scruton en particular, ese pensador que es el pensador de Occidente y piensa desde Occidente, y creo que en esta etapa del mundo, particularmente del mundo occidental, ha sido refrescante volver a él. Refrescante porque nos ha legado algo que nos ha posibilitado hoy y los últimos días dialogar desde disciplinas y perspectivas diversas, pero con una sensibilidad común, que es una agenda de temas y de problemas que son los que estamos viviendo, y una sensibilidad para con la tradición, para con la fe, para con una forma de ver el mundo. En segundo lugar, y esto es lo más importante, este espacio ha sido enormemente enriquecedor. En mi caso, y como muchos que hemos venido de parte de la Secretaría de Educación de la Nación, no volvemos igual. La presencialidad, el estar aquí, el encontrarse estos 3 días han sido una prueba más de que el esfuerzo por este tipo de eventos vale la pena. Y finalmente, y lo más importante, es que en nombre del Secretario de Educación de la Nación, el doctor Carlos Torrendel, envío las felicitaciones a todos los que han participado de este evento. Quiero ser estricto porque es el jefe. Y quiero transmitirles su apoyo absoluto a este evento y la invitación a que se continúen con este tipo de eventos, que este sea el inicio de una cadena de encuentros que nos reúna en distintos lugares, quizás en distintos países, a quienes compartimos una forma más que de pensar, de sentir el momento en el que estamos y valoramos. En nombre del Secretario de Educación de la Nación, muchísimas, muchísimas gracias.